The sign was old, older than most of the ships that had ever passed it, older than several of the civilizations that had read it and laughed and turned around anyway. The metal it was made from had no name in the Keth Consortium's material database, something dense and dark and resistant to the kind of radiation that should have eaten it down to dust 1,000 years ago. It floated at the edge of a star system that no one had named, not because no one had found it, because the system itself was just a boundary marker, a place where one kind of space ended and another kind began. The sign said in 47 languages, "You are entering human space. You were not invited. Turn around." That was all. No threat, no list of weapons pointed at you, no appeal to galactic law or interstellar treaty, no promise of diplomatic consequences, and no mention of the word war, no description of what happened to the last species that ignored it. Just those two sentences, and the 47 languages, 12 of which belonged to species that no longer existed anywhere in the known galaxy. Arbiter Thesavon had been staring at the sign's image on his screen for 6 hours when the directorate meeting began. He was old by most standards, 312 years, which was middle-aged for a Keth, but felt ancient in the way that only comes from spending a lifetime watching smart people make stupid decisions at a scale that kills millions. His skin shifted color the way all Keth skin did, involuntary, tied to emotion, a biological honesty he had never been able to turn off no matter how much diplomatic training he had received. Right now his skin was cycling through a deep amber. Amber was the color of dread. He sat in the back of the directorate chamber and watched the 12 members of the expansion directorate take their seats around the long, curved table. And he pressed his hands flat against his knees and told himself to speak clearly, to use simple words, to not let his expertise come out sounding like condescension, which it always did, which was always ignored. Sector Director Manavan called the meeting to order. Manavan was young, barely 90, and had the particular confidence of someone who had never personally witnessed a war. He had authorized 3 territorial expansions in his career. All 3 had been bloodless. The species living in those territories had either been too primitive to resist or too smart to try. He looked at the star maps laid out on the center table, and he looked at the 7 highlighted systems sitting inside the boundary marked on those maps, and he said in the comfortable tone of a man discussing lunch, "The resource assessments are favorable. I'm inclined to move forward. Are there any significant objections?" Thesavane raised his hand. Manavan's gaze found him with the polite patience of someone who already knew what they were going to hear and had already decided not to listen. "Arbiter," Thesavane stood. He kept his voice flat. "I want to read the classification report aloud before we vote. All of it, not the summary." "We've all read the summary. The summary is wrong." Silence in the chamber, not hostile silence. More like the silence of 12 people who were mildly surprised by the word wrong being used in their presence. Thesavane didn't wait for permission. See, he pulled up the report on his personal screen and began reading. The Keth Consortium's Xenodiplomacy Division had assessed humanity 3 times in the past 2 centuries. The first assessment, done 180 years ago, when humans had just achieved stable interstellar travel, had classified them as a Class 4 developing species. Curious, aggressive, internally fractured, not a significant factor. The second assessment, done 80 years later, had bumped them to Class 3 curiosity, still internally fractured, still aggressive, but now possessed of a small string of colonized systems and a military that the assessment described, with the particular arrogance of old empires, as adequate for border skirmishes. The third assessment had been written by Thesavane himself. He had spent 11 years on it. He had read everything. When not just the diplomatic summaries and the military capability indexes, he had read the histories, human histories, translated by the consortium's language AI into Keth, full of gaps and errors and approximations, but readable. He had read about their wars, all of them. He had read about the things they had done to each other across thousands of years, the weapons they had built, the tactics they had invented, the specific psychological relationship humanity had developed with the concept of being pushed past the point of survival. He had read about a period in their history, roughly 500 years before they ever left their home planet, where two factions of humans had pointed enough weapons at each other to render their entire world uninhabitable 17 times over. Not once, 17 times over, and had not used them. And not because they couldn't, not because someone stopped them, but because both sides, staring into that particular abyss, had decided, in the grinding, difficult, unheroic way that real decisions get made, that the cost was too high. That restraint had never made it into any previous consortium assessment of humanity, because it wasn't a military capability. It wasn't a technology. It didn't show up on a weapons inventory or a fleet manifest. It was just a choice a species had made once, under the worst possible pressure, and then kept making. Thesavane's assessment had concluded that humanity should be reclassified as a Class 1 asymmetric threat, and that no territorial action should be taken inside or adjacent to human space without full diplomatic groundwork and explicit invitation. The Expansion Directorate had thanked him for his thorough work and filed the report in the secondary archive. They had used the summary of the second assessment to plan the current expansion. He read all of this into the record, standing at the back of the room in a voice as flat and dry as paper. He did not editorialize. He did not raise his volume. His skin cycled through amber, darker amber, the brown black of something burning low. When he finished, Manavan said, "Your concerns are noted, Arbiter. However, the second assessment's military projections are clear. Their fleet assets, Thesavane said, are the ones they let us count." Another silence. Manavan tilted his head. "I'm not sure what that means." "It means," Thesavane said, "however, that a species which spent 4,000 years fighting itself against opponents who also knew how to fight understands something that we don't. It means that the only weapons that have ever won wars, in the long run, are the weapons the enemy doesn't know exist." He paused. "I don't know what they have, Director. That's exactly what concerns me. Our intelligence is complete. It's too complete. A species at that level of development does not have zero surprises in their defensive infrastructure. The absence of data is itself data." Manavan smiled the way people smile when they've already made up their mind and are being polite about it. "You're proposing we should be afraid of what we can't see." "I'm proposing," Thesavane said, "that we should be afraid of a sign that doesn't bother to list consequences." He held up the image. West the dark metal, the 47 languages, the dead species words still legible after 1,000 years. "Every empire that has ever issued a warning has listed its consequences. It's how warnings work. You tell them what will happen. You show your strength. You make them afraid of a specific thing." He set the image down. "This sign lists nothing. These people have been issuing this warning for over a century, and they have never once updated it with a description of what they'll do to you. Do you know what that means?" No one answered. "It means they think the warning is sufficient. They think anyone who reads it and still crosses the line deserves whatever comes next, and they are completely confident in their ability to deliver it." He looked at Manavan. "That is not the psychology of a Class 3 curiosity. And that is the psychology of something that has absolute faith in its own capability and zero interest in explaining itself." The vote was called. 11 in favor of proceeding, 1 against. Thesavane sat down. He pulled up a blank document on his screen and stared at it for a moment. He thought about writing a letter of resignation. He thought about getting on a shuttle and going back to the research station where he'd spent 11 years reading human history, where at least his expertise was allowed to be depressing in peace. He didn't write the letter. He didn't board a shuttle. He stayed in his seat and watched the fleet mobilization orders get signed. And he thought about the things he had read. About a general, thousands of years dead, who had crossed a river with his army and then burned his own boats on the far bank. No retreat. A no option. The river at their backs. The enemy ahead. Humans had a name for that kind of commitment. They had a name for a lot of things. The fleet assembled over 3 weeks. 42 warships in the vanguard. Sleek, enormous, painted in the consortium's administrative gray that was meant to signal order and authority and the weight of institutional power. Behind them, another 160 ships preparing to follow once the vanguard had established a foothold in the target systems. Fleet singer Drovan Ulkath commanded the vanguard from the bridge of the Voice of Expansion, the largest ship in the formation. He was young for his rank, barely 60, and he wore his youth like a medal. He had fought in 2 prior expansion campaigns. He had never lost a battle. His tactical record was clean in the way that early careers are clean when the opposition has never been capable of surprising you. He walked the bridge on the day of departure with his hands behind his back and his chin slightly elevated, which was the Keth body language for I have assessed this situation and found it manageable. His second, a cautious older officer named Pravath, stood at the sensor station and said, "The diplomatic advisory recommends we attempt a hailing transmission before crossing the beacon line." "We'll hail them after we cross," Drovan said, "from inside their space. Let them understand the posture before the conversation begins." Pravath said nothing. Her skin shifted to a color that was not quite amber and not quite gray. Drovan didn't notice. He was looking at the star maps, the 7 systems, and he highlighted in green, rich with the rare minerals the consortium's shipbuilding industry needed. Sitting there unclaimed and undefended, inside a line drawn by a species that thought a 2-sentence sign was a sufficient deterrent. He almost felt bad for them. Almost. The fleet jumped at 0330 Standard Time. FTL travel through consortium space was smooth. Their drives had been refined over 2 centuries to eliminate the nausea and disorientation of the early jump era. The transition was barely a flicker. One moment the star field outside the view screen was familiar. The next it was different, deeper. The stars in slightly different positions. Human space. Drovan looked at the sensor feeds. The 7 target systems lay ahead. The nearest was a 12-hour burn at standard cruise speed. A rocky, mineral-rich system with no habitation that the consortium surveys had confirmed as empty. The feeds showed nothing unusual. Empty space, background radiation, the quiet, cold geometry of the interstellar dark. And then, from behind them, the beacon they had crossed lit up. Not an alarm, not a siren. The beacon simply began to glow, its light warming from dead gray to a deep, steady amber, brighter than it should have been able to glow after 60 years of inactivity. As if it had been waiting, as if the crossing of the line had triggered something old and patient. Pravath said very quietly, "The beacon has activated." "Noted," Drovan said. He looked at the tactical display. The feed still showed nothing. No ships moving to intercept. No automated defense platforms spinning up. No response of any kind except the light. So he found that slightly annoying, actually. He had expected something. Some automated challenge. Some immediate display of whatever response they thought a 2-sentence warning justified. There was nothing. Just the light. "Proceed," he said. "Cruise speed. Standard formation." The fleet moved forward. The beacon burned behind them, amber and steady, its light traveling out across the border in all directions, not toward anything specific. Just out, the way a fire's out, the way a signal is out, meant to be seen by whoever was watching from wherever they were watching. And far away, in directions that Drovan's sensors were not pointed, in positions that the consortium's intelligence surveys had not cataloged. In the dark between stars where cold objects running cold and silent are indistinguishable from the background radiation of the universe. Things that had been still for a long time began to move. Thessavane watched the beacon's activation signal reach the consortium observation post where he had been assigned. Punishment duty, officially called diplomatic observer status, from a chair in a small room with a single screen and a cup of cold tea. He had been awake for 21 hours, not because he couldn't sleep, because he had not wanted to be asleep when this happened. He stared at the amber light on his screen. He thought about the sign, the 47 languages, the 12 dead ones. He thought about what it took for a species to write a warning in the language of civilizations that no longer existed, and the specific kind of patience that required, the specific kind of thinking, long thinking, far thinking, the thinking of a species that understood that the warning was not for the civilization that currently stood at their border, but for every civilization that would ever stand there. Permanent, timeless, patient as the metal it was written on. He thought about the species that had written it, the wars in their history, the weapons they had built and then not used, The river and the burning boats and the absolute faith of a people who had survived everything they had ever done to each other and emerged with a very simple, very clear understanding of what lines meant. He thought about the fleet. 42 ships. Good ships. Well crewed. Commanded by a young officer who had never been surprised. He turned off the screen. He sat in the dark for a little while. Then he turned it back on because he was an arbiter. And arbiters witnessed. And the least he could do, the very least, was watch. The amber light pulsed once, steady and slow, like a heartbeat that had never stopped. The fleet moved deeper into human space, and in the long, cold dark ahead of them, the things that had been waiting finished waking up. The first 12 hours inside human space were quiet. Too quiet, some of the junior officers said, in the way junior officers say things like that. Not because they were actually worried, but because the silence felt like it deserved a comment. Like the universe owed them something more dramatic than empty stars and background radiation. Drovan didn't say it. He didn't think it. He stood on the bridge of the voice of expansion and looked at his sensor feeds and felt the clean, familiar weight of being in command of something overwhelming. 42 ships, thousands of crew, enough firepower to reduce a small moon to gravel. The silence didn't bother him. Silence was what the week looked like from a distance. He had Prevath run a full sensor sweep every 2 hours. Standard protocol. The sweeps came back clean every time. Empty space, cold and vast, offering nothing. The 7 target systems lay ahead, patient as treasure, and the fleet moved toward them at cruise speed in the comfortable formation of a military force that had never had a reason to be subtle. At hour 14, Prevath said, "Contact." Drovan turned from the viewport. "Single contact," Prevath said. She was staring at her screen with an expression that Drovan couldn't immediately read. "Bearing 274, Mark 11, stationary, running lights active." Drovan crossed the bridge in 3 steps. He looked at the feed. It was a ship. One ship, sitting in open space between the fleet and the nearest target system, as if it had pulled up a chair and decided to wait. It wasn't moving. It wasn't taking any kind of combat posture. Its weapon systems, according to Prevath's readout, were cold. It was just there. And it was, by every metric the consortium's sensors could measure, a mid-class human vessel. Destroyer weight. Roughly equivalent to 12 of the ships in Drovan's own formation in terms of raw size. They had 42. Drovan looked at the single ship sitting in the dark and felt something he would not have called amusement. It was too small a feeling for that word, but was closest to it. The particular lightness of a situation that has confirmed exactly what you expected. "Open a channel," he said. Prevath opened it. The screen filled with a face. Human faces still unsettled some of the Keth crew. The features were too still in some ways and too mobile in others. A species that had evolved to communicate emotion through a face instead of skin color, which meant the face was doing a tremendous amount of work that Keth biology simply didn't require. The eyes especially. 2 of them, front-facing, predator-placed, and in this particular face, a color that the consortium's translating AI described as gray-green, but which looked on the screen like the color of deep water before a storm. Admiral Seraphine Voss looked at Drovan the way a closed door looked at someone who had just tried the handle. "Fleet Singer," she said. The universal translator in Drovan's earpiece rendered her words in clean, flat Keth. "You crossed the beacon line at 0340 standard. That's logged. I'm giving you one opportunity to log a course correction." Drovan took a breath. He kept his posture easy, relaxed. The posture of a man who was doing the other person a courtesy by even engaging with them. "Admiral," he said, "I appreciate the greeting. However, I believe there may be some confusion about the nature of this situation. The Keth Consortium has determined that the systems ahead represent unclaimed territory, and we intend to establish a presence there in accordance with Consortium expansion doctrine. We have no quarrel with the human commonwealth. This is a resource matter, not a territorial challenge." Voss did not blink, did not shift, did not react in any of the ways Drovan was experienced at reading. No skin color change, because humans didn't do that. No posture adjustment, no intake of breath. She just looked at him. Then she said, "The question isn't what you intend. The question is what you did." Dravan spread his hands slightly, a Keth gesture for "let us be reasonable." "And what we did was cross a line drawn unilaterally by the human commonwealth in space that is not—" "What you did," Voss said, "is already been answered. You just don't know it yet." The channel closed. Dravan stared at the dark screen for a moment. His skin stayed its normal neutral color. He did not allow himself amber. He turned to Privath. "Hailing frequency." "Sir." Privath's voice was different, a half-step different. The difference between a person reporting a fact and a person reporting something that has made the inside of their chest go cold. "I'm getting returns. Mass contacts, multiple. Location, everywhere." That word. Privath never used that word. Dravan moved to the tactical display. He looked at it. They were coming from the asteroid belt that curved along the edge of the system. A natural feature, dense and unremarkable, exactly the kind of geological noise that made deep scanning difficult. They were moving in from two other approach vectors Drovan had not designated as threat corridors because they were long, exposed runs with no tactical advantage. 57 contacts, running cold. All of them. No active sensors, no weapon locks, no targeting emissions. Just mass and thermal signatures that were materializing from the dark like they had always been there. Like the empty space had been a coat that was now coming off, because they had been there. Dravan understood this in the space between one heartbeat and the next. They had been there before his fleet arrived. They had been positioned, not scrambled in response, not launched from some nearby station, not called in after his crossing of the beacon line. Pre-positioned, before the line was crossed, before the fleet even assembled. Waiting. He thought of something Thesivane had said in the Directorate chamber, which he had not been present for but had read in the official record. The absence of data is itself data. His tactical AI began working. It was running intercept projections. The 57 contacts were not on intercept courses. Not yet. They were holding at distance, arranged in a pattern that Dravan's AI flagged as formation type. Unrecognized. Not a standard encirclement, not a defensive screen. Something else. Something that his AI, with its database of 1,400 species combat doctrines, could not match to anything in its memory. He looked at the single human destroyer, still sitting in the same position it had occupied. Still stationary, still running lights on. Still weapon systems cold. It hadn't moved. It didn't need to move. It had never been the thing he was supposed to be looking at. It had been the thing he was supposed to be talking to while the other things got into position. Except they had already been in position, which meant the conversation had been a courtesy. That was the word that arrived in his mind and would not leave. She had given him a courtesy, a final opportunity to look at the situation clearly. Not because she expected him to take it, but because she was the kind of commander who offered it anyway, who logged the offer the same way she had logged his crossing of the beacon line, who was building a record not for the consortium or for Galactic Court or for any audience at all, but for the specific satisfaction of someone who does things correctly. He thought about the word logged. She had said it twice. His second transmission attempt got no response. The channel opened and stayed open, and Voss simply did not appear. Privath said, "The contacts are beginning to move." Formation? Still unrecognized. They're not converging. It's more like— Privath paused. She was not a junior officer. She did not make uncertain pauses. The fact that she was making one now registered somewhere in the back of Drovan's mind as significant. It's more like they're filling gaps. Like they know where we'll move before we move there. Drovan looked at the tactical display. The 57 contacts had repositioned. Not toward his fleet, around it, above, below, flanking, in the specific places that a fleet would move to if it wanted to break contact and retreat. The escape corridors. Every one of them was now occupied by a human ship running cold and patient and waiting. His fleet was not surrounded, not exactly. It was more that every direction that wasn't forward, toward the target systems and deeper into human space, now had a human ship sitting in it like a question mark. He could go forward. He could not go back. The single destroyer finally moved. It came forward slowly, directly toward the fleet, following a line so straight and deliberate that it was almost insulting. Not a combat approach. An approach that said, I am the one you will deal with. I am choosing to come to you. Think about what that means. Voss opened the channel herself this time. She didn't wait for him to speak. She said, You have 42 ships. I have 58, and they've been here longer than you have. Your exit vectors are covered. This is where the courtesy ends. Dravan felt something happening in his chest that he identified, with some difficulty, as the first stage of a kind of understanding he had never needed before. Not fear. Fear was familiar. Fear was useful. This was different. This was the feeling of a mental map that had been correct his entire career, suddenly showing him a territory it had never accounted for. You anticipated us, he said. Yes. How long ago? Voss looked at something off-screen, then back at him. The beacon activation isn't the warning, she said. The warning was the sign. The beacon activation is the start of the response. The response was ready before you were. She paused. Do you want to know when we started building this fleet's intercept position? He did. He was not sure he wanted to, but he did. 11 years ago, she said, when one of your arbiters submitted a report recommending you not do this. We read it. Dravan was quiet. Where the AI in his tactical station was still running projections. It was projecting outcomes now, engagement outcomes, based on the contact signatures of the 58 human ships. The outcomes were not favorable. The AI expressed this in the bloodless language of percentage calculations and casualty estimates, and the numbers it was producing were the kind of numbers that ended careers, ended fleets. This doesn't have to be an engagement, Dravan said. He said it carefully, not desperately. A commander's voice, not a frightened one. I have authorization to discuss terms. The terms were on the sign, Voss said. You were invited to turn around. You didn't. There are no other terms. He looked at her face, the gray-green eyes, the absolute stillness of it. He thought about the last thing Thessalvane had said before the vote. Eddie, they think the warning is sufficient. They think anyone who reads it and still crosses the line deserves whatever comes next, and they are completely confident in their ability to deliver it. He looked at the tactical display, at 57 cold contacts that had been sitting in the dark for 11 years, at the math his AI was producing. I'd like to transmit to the main fleet, he said. Voss said, your communications with the main fleet are being relayed through our systems. The signal will go through. We're not interested in ambushes. We're interested in being clear. He nodded once. He opened the fleet channel. He said, all ships, this is Fleet Singer Ulkath. Be aware we have encountered prepared opposition in significant numbers at the following coordinates. He sent the tactical data. He kept talking. He gave them everything. Shiver formation, contact count, position, the 11-year pre-positioning that had turned empty space into a trap that didn't look like a trap. He gave them Voss's offer and what it meant and what the numbers said. He paused. Then he said, recommend the main fleet hold at the beacon line pending further assessment. This is not... He stopped, started again. This is not the situation we were briefed on. He closed the channel. Voss was still on screen. Your call to the main fleet, she said. Was that your recommendation or your order? Recommendation, Dravan said. I don't control the main fleet's movements. Something passed through her face. It was too small and too fast to read, but it was there. Then we'll see what they decide, she said. She left the channel open this time. She sat in her chair on the bridge of her destroyer, and she watched him, and he watched her, and the 57 human ships sat in their positions in the dark with their weapons cold and their patience absolute. And Drovan had the long, strange, humbling experience of understanding that the patience was not a performance. It was just what they were. Pravath said very quietly beside him, the main fleet is holding at the beacon line. Dravan let out a breath. Voss on screen gave a very slight nod. The nod of someone who had considered several possible outcomes and found this one acceptable. Then she said, I want you to understand something, Fleet Singer. Not as a negotiating position, just as a fact. He looked at her. I didn't want this engagement. None of my people want this engagement. We have been waiting here for 11 years hoping that your government would take the warning seriously and that we could go home. She glanced down for a moment. But you crossed the line. That means we finish this. Your 42 ships cannot leave until your main fleet withdraws past the beacon line, and the diplomatic contact I specify has confirmed they'll stay there. She looked up. Your people cooperate, and your crews go home. That's the deal. Dravan looked at her for a long time. He thought about the sign. He thought about 2 sentences and no listed consequences, and 12 dead civilizations whose words were still legible on metal that didn't corrode. He thought about what it took to write a warning like that, the specific kind of faith it required, the absolute, unshakable belief that what you were and what you could do was so clear, so established, so undeniable that you didn't need to explain it. You just needed to say, "We didn't invite you." He contacted the main fleet again. He said, "Tell them to stop. Tell them all of it." In his small room on the observation post, Thessavane watched the tactical feeds his clearance level, still allowed him to access, and drank his cold tea, and felt something he did not have a word for in his language. He would find the human word for it later. The word was relief, the grinding, exhausted, almost painful relief of a person who has been correct about a terrible thing and has watched the terrible thing not become as terrible as it could have been. Not yet. He looked at the feeds. The main fleet held at the beacon line. The vanguard sat in human space, all contained. No shots fired, no ships lost. It could end here. He put his hand on the cold wall of his small room and thought about Voss's face on the diplomatic intercept he had been allowed to access. The gray-green eyes, the absolute stillness. He thought about the 11 years. He had filed his report. The humans had read it. They had spent 11 years preparing a response to a fleet whose assembly, Thessavane's own government, had begun 7 years after his report was filed. They had been 4 years ahead of the problem. He thought about that for a long time. He thought about what kind of people planned 4 years ahead for a war they didn't want. The answer he knew, the answer he had spent 11 years reading into. We was the only kind of people who had survived long enough to become the kind of people who wrote warnings in the languages of the dead. He turned off the feed. He tried to sleep. He could not. The main fleet did not stop. Dravan received the confirmation from Privath in the same flat tone she used for all tactical reports, because Privath understood that the worst news in the world still needed to be delivered in a tone that did not make things worse. She handed him the data. The main fleet had received his transmission, had received his assessment, had received the tactical data showing 57 pre-positioned human ships and the numbers his AI had generated. The Directorate had overridden the hold order. The main fleet was crossing the beacon line. 200 ships. Dravan stood at the tactical display and looked at the incoming signatures and felt the specific, unpleasant sensation of a man who has just discovered that the situation he thought he understood was actually a smaller situation sitting inside a larger situation that he had not been told about. He opened the channel to Voss. She was already on screen. She had already seen the incoming contacts. Her face had not changed. This was the thing that Drovan kept returning to in the hours and days after, whenever he tried to reconstruct the sequence of events with the dispassionate accuracy his incident report would require. He kept looking for the moment when her face changed, when she showed surprise or alarm, or the particular tensing of a commander recalculating the odds. There was no such moment. She looked at the incoming fleet signatures the same way she had looked at his 42 ships, as if this was a different number, not a different situation. "Fleet Singer," she said, "I want to confirm that the incoming force is moving against your recommendation." "Yes," he said, "and that you understand that changes the terms I offered." He looked at the number, 200 ships, his 42 plus 200. He said, "What are the new terms?" She said, "There aren't any." The battle began at the edge of the asteroid belt. The human ships had been running cold since before Drovan's fleet ever arrived. But the moment the consortium's main fleet crossed the beacon line, they lit up all at once. Weapons hot, sensors active, the vast electromagnetic bloom of a military force that was done waiting. Dravan's tactical display went from a careful, calibrated picture to a blizzard of contacts and fire signatures that his AI struggled to process fast enough to be useful. 240 consortium ships, 58 human ships. The math said one thing. The battle said something else. Dravan had been in engagements before. He knew what engagements felt like, the terrible logic of them, the way two forces behaved according to their training and their doctrine and their commander's best judgment, and how the outcome, however brutal, was always something a tactician could trace the shape of afterward. There was always a pattern. There was always a readable grammar to how a species fought. You learned it in the first 20 minutes, and then you exploited it for the rest of the engagement. The human ships had no grammar he could read. The first thing they did was not converge, not as a fleet, not as squadrons. Each human ship began what Drovan's AI logged as an independent engagement, and the independence was real, not the result of communications lag or broken chain of command. Each captain was making their own decisions in real time, in reaction to what was immediately in front of them. No central coordination signal, no command relay. Each ship was acting as if it was in a different battle from the ship 50 kilometers away. And it was working. A human frigate, a small ship, lightly armored, outgunned by the three consortium destroyers pursuing it, led its pursuers through a debris field for 8 minutes at speeds that should have stripped its hull down to the frame. It used the debris, not as cover in the way any tactical AI would calculate cover, as weapons. It flew close enough to large rocks that the consortium ships behind it either had to slow or absorb the collision. And when they slowed, the frigate turned back into them at an angle that Drovan's AI classified as suboptimal 3 separate times before the frigate's guns came into range and proved the AI wrong. The pattern kept not appearing. Drovan's fleet commanders kept looking for it. They kept sending him assessments in the rapid shorthand of tactical combat. Their left flank is drawing back, should we press? And he would authorize the press, and the ships would move into the opening, and the opening would close in a new way, not like a trap, but like water filling a cup. And what had been an open flank was now something else. It's something that the AI spent valuable processing time trying to name. At the 2-hour mark, a consortium heavy cruiser caught one of the human destroyers in a pincer with 2 flanking vessels. A clean kill. Textbook. Dravan watched the 3 ships converge on the smaller human vessel on his tactical display and felt the first thing that day that felt like familiar ground. The human destroyer took the first hits. Hull damage. It began to drift. Not retreat, drift. The way a ship drifts when you've hurt its drive systems. The consortium cruiser moved in for the final approach. Standard doctrine, moving to the damaged ship's blind spot. The human destroyer fired its lateral thrusters and rotated in place. Not its drive thrusters, its lateral correction thrusters. The small ones meant for docking maneuvers and minor course adjustments. Yet using them to rotate a warship in combat was, the AI said, tactically inadvisable. The rotation took 4 seconds. The human destroyer completed it and was now pointing at the cruiser that had moved into its blind spot, and the main guns were in range, and the human destroyer fired twice. The consortium cruiser was gone. Dravan stared at the tactical display. He called his fleet commander. Reclassify the damaged human contacts. Don't treat a damaged ship as a reduced threat. He paused. Treat it as a ship that has decided to do something your AI can't predict. The fleet commander acknowledged. It didn't help as much as Drovan hoped, because the thing his commanders needed was not a different set of orders. The thing they needed was a different AI database, and no such database existed, because the humans had never fought anyone outside their own species, and the consortium's intelligence on human combat doctrine was entirely theoretical, assembled from long-range observation and intercepted communications that had been too encrypted to read properly. The archive that existed on human warfare was a human archive. 4,000 years of conflict, tactic, counter-tactic, innovation, counter-innovation. A living record of a species stress-testing itself against itself across centuries. And what came out the other side of that crucible was not a fixed doctrine, not a rigid set of tactics that could be cataloged and countered. What came out was adaptation, the ability to change, mid-fight, under fire, faster than an enemy could read the change and respond to it. Dravan's AI could analyze a tactic in 0.3 seconds. By the time it analyzed the tactic, the humans had already moved to something else. At the 3-hour mark, a consortium wing, 12 ships operating in standard defensive formation, began taking fire from an unexpected angle and broke formation to respond. The break was correct procedure. You maintain formation until formation becomes a liability. Then you break and reform. The 12 ships broke. They did not reform. Not because they were destroyed. Because the moment they broke, each individual ship commander was making their own assessment of the new geometry. And the individual assessments produced 12 different responses. And those 12 responses left gaps between them, and the human ships that had been waiting for exactly those gaps moved into them. In 3 minutes, one consortium wing ceased to exist as a tactical unit. Woodrow pulled the voice of expansion back to command range. He needed altitude on the situation. He needed to see it as a whole. The tactical display showed him the whole. He wished it hadn't. His numbers were still better. Still significantly better. Attrition was working in his favor, the way attrition always worked for a larger force. They were losing ships, but the humans were losing ships too, and the humans had fewer to lose. If this was purely a numbers problem, if the outcome was simply a function of who ran out of ships first, the consortium fleet would win. He watched a human carrier, its forward section blown open, its crew compartments exposed to vacuum, continue to fly and fight. Its fighter wing was still operating from its rear bay. Its point defense was still active. Wait, it was burning internally in 3 places, and it kept doing its job. Kept being a carrier, kept launching fighters until there was nothing left to launch. He watched one of his own ships, a cruiser with comparable damage, begin the standard withdrawal procedure. He thought about the carrier. He thought about the thing Thessalvane had read into the archives and tried to explain. A species that treats extinction pressure as a motivational tool. He'd thought that was rhetoric, an old diplomat's way of explaining why an enemy should be taken seriously, useful for making arguments in directorate chambers. It was not rhetoric. It was a description. At the 4-hour mark, Jovan watched the thing that ended his ability to think about the battle in terms of numbers. A human destroyer, not large, not a flagship, a functional mid-weight combat vessel, took catastrophic damage to its engines. Drive system gone. It was coasting on its last velocity, no ability to maneuver. Its guns still working, but its position now fixed and predictable. A fixed, predictable position in a warship is a death sentence. 3 consortium vessels were moving toward it on intercept courses. The human ship could not evade them. Its remaining armament could hurt them, but not stop all 3. Jovan watched the tactical feed. He saw the human destroyer's crew bay show a small spike in thermal activity. Escape pods warming up. Good. They were preparing to evacuate. They would take their people off a dead ship, and the consortium vessels would finish the hull and move on. The escape pods launched, all of them. The heat signatures of 12 pods moving away from the dying ship, out of the engagement zone, carrying the crew to safety. The human destroyer, now crewless, accelerated. The drive system that had been gone, the main drive system, the one that had taken the catastrophic hit, stayed gone. But there were secondary systems, maneuvering systems, small burn, not fast, not powerful, enough. The human destroyer moved, crewless, running on a program someone had entered into its navigation system before they got on their escape pod. Running toward the 3 consortium vessels at the best speed it could manage with nothing but maneuvering thrusters and what remained of its frame. The 3 consortium ships broke off. They had to. Into a ship on a ramming course with no crew to threaten and no mind to negotiate with and no self-preservation instinct to exploit was not a tactical problem. It was a road hazard. They broke off. The human destroyer's hull finally gave out at a distance that was not close enough to be a threat, but was close enough to scatter debris across all 3 ships' sensor arrays. 3 consortium vessels were out of the fight for the next 8 minutes, running passive only, blind. Jovan stared at the feed. He thought about the crew of that destroyer. He thought about the person who had sat at the navigation console and entered the ramming course into the system. He thought about the fact that they had had time to do it differently, had had time to use the secondary maneuvering systems themselves, to try to fight, to try to matter. They had chosen to put their crew on the pods and turn their ship into a tool instead. That was not desperation. Desperation looked like what Drovin's own ships were doing, withdrawing, clustering, seeking the safety of numbers. Desperation was fear-driving behavior. What he had just watched was not fear. It was the opposite of fear. It was the absolute, clear-eyed decision of people who understood their situation completely and had chosen the most useful possible response to it. They had been out of options and they had invented a new one. His AI said, engagement style. Unrecognized. He had stopped expecting it to say anything else. The battle ended at hour 6. Not with a final dramatic blow. Not with a flagship going down or a commander surrendering. It ended the way water wins against stone. Too slowly to point at a single moment. Hushed too completely to pretend it hadn't happened. Drovan was in an escape pod. He did not know exactly when he had made the decision to get into it. He remembered the voice of expansion taking its final hit. A lance of fire through the bridge section that turned the command station beside him into a temperature he had no word for. He remembered Prevath pulling him by the arm. He remembered the pod bay. He remembered the release. He was floating. Around him, in the debris-thickened space that had been a battle, he could count the lights of other escape pods. Consortium crew, his people, alive. Not many. He looked out the small viewport and tried to count the debris fields that had been his ships. He stopped counting. He activated the pod's short-range transmitter and opened a channel to the nearest human vessel. He identified himself. When he gave his pod's location, he waited. Voss's voice came back within 2 minutes. She said, "Fleet Singer, confirm your status." He said, "Alive. My crew that made it to pods, alive. I have no casualty numbers yet." She said, "We'll recover the pods." He said, "Thank you." There was a silence on the channel, not a hostile one. The silence of two people who had just been in the same event and had not yet found the right size of words for it. He said, "Your crews. What were your losses?" Another silence. Then she said, "Significant." He closed his eyes. He thought about the carrier still fighting with its hull open. He thought about the destroyer's empty crew bay. He thought about the person at the navigation console. He said, "I need to send a transmission to the main fleet." Voss said, "Go ahead." He composed it carefully. He did not use tactical language. He did not use the language of commanders reporting outcomes to their superiors. He used the only language that felt true. He said, to whatever ships were still at the beacon line, to whoever was still out there deciding what to do next. Don't. One word. He sent it. He looked out the viewport at the debris and the stars and the distant running lights of human ships moving through the field, collecting the pods, picking up his people with the same unhurried thoroughness they'd applied to everything else. He thought about the battle, about the grammar that had never appeared, about the AI saying unrecognized over and over until the word had lost its meaning. He thought about what they were. He did not have a complete answer. He suspected no one on the consortium side did. But he had the beginning of one, the outline of one, the shape of an answer that would take him years to fully understand. They were a species that had taken everything, every scar, every war, every terrible thing they had ever survived, and every terrible thing they had ever done, and had turned it into craft. Not rage, not savagery, not the blind momentum of a species that fought because it couldn't stop. Craft, the careful, patient, deeply practiced ability to do what needed doing, as long as it needed doing, in exactly the right way, and then stop. The pod drifted. The running lights moved through the dark. He waited to be collected, and he thought, and he did not send any more transmissions, because there was nothing more useful to say. Don't. Everything else was just explanation. The directorate met in emergency session for 11 hours. The doors were closed. The feeds were sealed. The proceedings were classified under a tier that the Sylvain, even in his observer posting, did not technically have clearance to access. He accessed them anyway. He had spent 40 years in xenodiplomacy. He knew which nodes in the relay network had not been updated in the last decade and still ran on old authentication protocols. He sat in his small room and listened to the session on a channel that officially did not exist, and drank tea that was, for once, the correct temperature. What he heard was not unexpected. The directorate was afraid. This was the correct response, and for the first time in Thesavane's professional memory, the correct response was the one they were having. The Vanguard was gone. The main fleet was holding at the beacon line, shaken, waiting for orders. Drovan Ulkath's single-word transmission had been received and was being treated as a field assessment from the most experienced commander who had observed the situation at first hand. Don't. The Directorate was debating what don't meant strategically. Sector Director Manavan was not present at the session. He had submitted a medical leave request. The acting director was Koveth, an older member of the Directorate who had spent 30 years in resource management and had never authorized a military expansion, but had also never stopped one. Koveth said, in the session Thesavane was not authorized to hear, "We need to understand what we are dealing with. A force of 58 ships that held back 240. Someone said, the numbers were not the factor. The approach was the factor. Koveth said, then we change the approach. We send a force large enough that approach becomes irrelevant. Where numbers are sufficient, tactics are secondary. Thesavane closed his eyes. Someone on the session, a younger voice, one he didn't recognize in mind, said, that assumes a linear relationship between scale and outcome. The Vanguard was 42 ships. The full engagement was 240. The size of the force did not change the nature of the result. Why would a larger force? Because we have not yet crossed the threshold, Koveth said. There is always a threshold. Send enough and the threshold is crossed. Thesavane opened a document on his screen. He began typing the same letter he had started writing months ago and never sent. His resignation. He got 3 lines in and stopped. One, he was not going to send a resignation. He knew he wasn't. He was going to stay at his posting and watch, because he was an arbiter's witness. And if there was any chance at all, that his presence and his record and his dissent vote meant something to the humans monitoring consortium communications, he needed to stay where they could see him staying. He closed the document. He went back to listening. Koveth said, 400 ships, full mobilization. We send everything and we make this clean. The fleet assembled over 2 months. Thesavane watched it from his posting. 400 ships drawn from every corner of consortium space, the largest military force the consortium had mobilized in a century. It was the kind of force that had ended the Saravath Dominion in 6 weeks, with the kind of force that had reduced the Preth Collective's home system to a scorched notation in the historical record and moved on without ceremony. Institutional response. That was the only honest name for it. Not strategy, not careful thinking about what had failed and why, and what a different approach might achieve. Brand management. The consortium could not be seen losing to a Class 3 curiosity. The label had already been quietly updated in internal records. Nobody had officially reclassified humanity, because to do so would be to admit that Thesavane's 11-year assessment had been correct and the previous assessment had been wrong. And the Directorate had a consistent and determined relationship with being wrong that could best be described as open denial. So the label remained unchanged and the fleet was assembled. Sonarand, the official rationale was escalated resource protection, which was the kind of phrase that meant nothing and therefore could not be argued with. Thesavane was given new orders. He was to accompany the fleet as diplomatic observer. His job would be to manage any post-engagement negotiations with the human commonwealth, terms of their withdrawal from the contested systems, reparations framework, the administrative language of a defeated party arranging an orderly end. He accepted the orders. He did not believe in the mission they described. He packed one bag. He brought the full archive of human history that he had spent 11 years reading, not because he expected to have time to read it again, because he had carried it for 11 years and it felt wrong to leave it behind. He boarded the fleet. And the fleet crossed the beacon line on a morning that felt, in every objective way, exactly like the morning before it. The beacon lit up. This time it was amber from the first moment. It had never gone fully dark after the previous crossing. It had been burning at low intensity for 2 months, as if it needed less energy to stay lit now that it had been reminded what it was for. Thesavane watched the crossing from the observation lounge of the diplomatic vessel assigned to the fleet, a large viewport, generous and clear, facing the direction of travel. The stars of human space did not look different from the stars outside it. The dark did not look deeper. There was nothing visible to indicate that anything had changed. He sat with his archive in his lap and his hands folded over it and looked at the stars. The fleet spread out across his view, 400 ships, gray and enormous, moving at the measured pace of a force that had not been told it needed to hurry. Because 400 was enough. 400 was the threshold that the Directorate believed existed. And the Directorate believed in thresholds the way old institutions believe in the things that have worked before, long past the point where they have stopped being true. Tessavain looked at the stars. He thought about 11 years. He thought about the humans who had read his report, the humans who had begun building an intercept position 4 years before the consortium's fleet ever assembled. He thought about 11 years of maintenance, of supplies, of keeping ships cold and quiet and ready in an asteroid belt, of the extraordinary organizational patience that required. He thought about what kind of military culture could ask its crews to sit in the dark for 11 years and call that preparation rather than punishment. He thought about the archives he had read, the wars, the long ones especially, the ones that had dragged across decades, grinding and terrible, and the people who had survived them, and what the survivors had carried into the peacetime that eventually came. A memory unasked for, a line from a human historical text, a translation so old and rough that he had nearly skipped it, a general writing to their government from a siege that had lasted 3 years. We will outlast them. Not because we are stronger, because we are more willing to wait. He had read it once and moved on. He had read it again, later in the context of something else, and stopped. More willing to wait, not faster, not stronger, not more powerful in any conventional sense. More willing. The fleet was 4 hours into human space when the sensors began returning data that the AI could not immediately process. Tessavain heard the alert tone from the observation lounge. He looked up from the archive. He looked at the stars outside the viewport. The stars had not changed, but space between them had. They came from everywhere. That was the only honest description, and Tessavain heard it used later in the accounts of the crew members who survived, in the debriefs, in the incident reports that tried to build a tactical narrative out of something that had not felt tactical from inside it. They came from everywhere. Not from a direction, not from a position, from everywhere all at once. One as if the dark itself had decided to stop pretending and become visible. The humans had not prepositioned 58 ships this time. The humans had prepositioned more. Tessavain could not count the contacts on the sensor feed from his viewport. The numbers his diplomatic vessel's secondary sensors were returning were the kind of numbers that belonged in a different category from the one that had been used to plan this engagement. The Directorate had calculated a threshold, the number of consortium ships that would make human resistance tactically impossible. That number was 400. The humans had calculated the same threshold from the other direction and had spent 11 years making sure they were above it. Tessavain sat in the observation lounge with his archive in his lap and watched human space perform the particular mercy of being exactly what it had said it was. The engagement lasted 6 hours. He did not watch most of it. Not because it was difficult to watch, not because he looked away out of squeamishness or grief, though both were present, but because there was nothing in the watching that added information he did not already have. The sensors showed him a story he had been reading for 11 years. He knew the ending. He had known the ending since he first read a 2-sentence warning written in the languages of dead civilizations and understood what the absence of listed consequences meant. He watched the first hour. Now he watched the human ships move through the consortium fleet with the same unreadable grammar Jervan had described in his transmission. Not chaotic, not random, but adaptive in a way that no tactical AI could keep up with. Each ship an independent decision engine, drawing on 4,000 years of compressed institutional knowledge that lived not in a database, but in the bones of every commander who had ever been trained by a commander who had been trained by a commander. Back through the long, terrible history of a species that had fought itself into competence. He watched the second hour. He stopped watching. He sat with his archive and read for the last time the accounts he had already read 100 times each. The battles, the generals, the admirals, the people who had built the doctrine, or the people who had broken the doctrine and built a better one, the people who had lost and learned, the people who had won and stayed humble about it because they knew that the only thing winning a war guaranteed was another war, and you had better be ready. He had tried to explain this to the Directorate. He had used words like asymmetric and adaptive and historical depth. He had used the language of threat assessment because that was the language they understood. He should have used simpler words. He should have said, they have been doing this to each other for 4,000 years. Every mistake that can be made in a war, they have made it. Every lesson that can be learned from a war, they have learned it. We are not fighting a military. We are fighting a library that can shoot back. He hadn't said it. They wouldn't have listened. And when the engagement ended, the diplomatic vessel Thesevain was on had suffered no damage. The humans had not targeted it. He did not know if that was deliberate, if someone on the human side had flagged the diplomatic vessel as non-combatant and instructed their ships to leave it alone, or if it had simply been too small and too peripheral to matter. He suspected it was deliberate. He was sitting in the observation lounge looking at the quiet stars when the communications console gave a soft tone. Not the general fleet channel, the diplomatic channel. The channel that was supposed to be for Thesevain's post-engagement negotiations. The surrender terms, the withdrawal framework, the administrative language of an ending. He looked at the console. He moved to it. He opened the channel. Admiral Voss's face appeared on the screen. She looked the same as she had the first time he had seen her, in the intercept he had accessed from his small room. The gray-green eyes, the absolute stillness, the face of a person who was doing a job and found drama about doing it unnecessary. She said, "Arbiter Thesevain," he said. "Admiral," she said, "your dissent vote is logged. You're cleared to retrieve your survivors. Don't cross the line again." He sat very still. He said, "You knew." She did not answer that. It was not a question that required answering. Of course she knew. She had read his report. She had spent 11 years in preparation that was built partly on the intelligence his report had contained. She had known who was on this fleet and who had voted how and what it meant. She had waited 11 years to tell him, not to punish him. He understood that. She was not a person who punished. She was a person who was precise. She had waited to tell him because there had been no other way to tell him that mattered. You could not deliver that message before the battle. You could only deliver it after, when the weight of everything that had just happened was sitting in the room with both of you, and the words could mean what they needed to mean. Your dissent vote is logged. We saw you. We know you tried. That matters. He sat with that for a long time. Then he said, "The survivors. I don't know how many there are." She said, "We're collecting the pods. You'll have a manifest within the hour." He nodded. He thought about what to say next. He thought about all the things he might say, about the engagement, about the years, about the report, and about the fleet assembling in the terrible certainty that 400 was a threshold and the humans were below it. He said, "I'm sorry." It was not what a diplomat said. It was not a position or a statement or an opening to negotiation. It was just the truth, the simplest unit of it, the only one that fit. Voss looked at him. She said, "I know." Then, "Go find your people." The channel closed. Thesevain sat in the quiet observation lounge for a moment. The viewport showed him human space, the same stars as before the battle, unchanged, patient. The dark between them, full of things he had not known were there. He looked at his archive. He had carried it for 11 years. He had read every word in it. He thought about a species that had written a warning in 47 languages, including the languages of civilizations that no longer existed. He thought about what that said about the way they thought about time, about permanence, about the relationship between a warning and the thing that enforced it. They had not built the fleet to threaten. They had not positioned the ships to intimidate. They had not written the sign to frighten. They had done all of it because they meant it, every piece of it. The sign, the patience, the ships in the dark, the battle, the manifests of the dead. The channel opened to one Keth diplomat who had voted the wrong way in a room full of people voting the wrong way. All of it meant, completely and without decoration. He stood up. He went to find his people. The beacon was still burning when the diplomatic vessel crossed back over the line. Amber, steady, patient. Thesevain looked at it through the viewport as they passed it. The dark metal, the 47 languages. He had read them all at some point. Some of them he had read in the original, working from partial translation matrices and guesswork. Some of them were languages he had studied specifically for the 11 years of his assessment. He looked at the sign until it was behind them and the stars of consortium space were ahead. He thought about what came next. The directorate reconvening, the incident reports, the diplomatic reconstruction of a catastrophe that had been avoidable, his role in the conversations that would follow. He thought about what he would say. He thought about simple words. He thought about what Voss had said and what she hadn't said, and the particular weight of the things left unspoken by people who trusted you to be intelligent enough to carry them. He opened a new document on his screen. He began to write. Not a resignation, not an assessment, a testimony. What he had seen, what he had known, what he had tried, what had happened, and what it meant. Written in the simplest language he could manage, stripped of diplomatic formality and institutional framing, for any member of the directorate or any future government who might read it and want to understand. The first line was, "They mean the sign." He kept writing. The galaxy found out slowly and then all at once. That was how these things always moved. Through the relay networks, through the diplomatic channels, way through the trading posts and the border stations where different species ships docked and refueled, and their crews talked to each other with the loose, unguarded honesty of people who were far from home and among strangers. The official consortium communications were sealed and classified and managed. The unofficial ones were not. Within 3 months, every spacefaring civilization within 100 light years knew the broad shape of what had happened. Within 6 months, they knew the details. 240 ships lost in the first engagement, 400 ships lost in the second, 640 consortium vessels deployed in the largest military mobilization in a century, sent into human space against a warning that had been standing for over 100 years. Gone. The math was the first shock. The first thing every species' military divisions did when they heard was run their own calculations, input the numbers into their own tactical AIs, check the models. 158 human ships against 240, a prepared position against a larger force. The models produced outcomes that looked plausible, tight, costly, but not impossible. The humans had geography and preparation on their side, a skilled defense against a less careful offense. Unusual, but within the range of explicable military outcomes. Then the second engagement. 400 consortium ships against a larger human force, prepared again, positioned again, in a kill box that had been built 11 years in advance. The models ran the numbers. The models produced results that the AI flagged as requiring manual review. The results were reviewed. The manual review confirmed them. That was when the shock became something else. Something quieter and more durable than shock. Something closer to the particular feeling of a person standing at the edge of a very deep thing and only just now understanding how deep it goes. The Galactic Compact, which was the loose body of interstellar law and treaty that most spacefaring civilizations nominally participated in, held an emergency session 4 months after the second engagement. Tassavan attended as a consortium representative, which was a position he had been given not because anyone on the directorate thought he was right. They still would not say out loud that he had been right, because being unable to say out loud that you were wrong was the directorate's most consistent and most costly policy. But because he was the only person in the consortium who had actually communicated with a senior human commander and emerged from that communication with anything more than wreckage to show for it, he sat in the compact chamber and listened to the representatives of 14 species ask the same question in 14 different registers and vocabularies and levels of alarm. What are they? Species that had never had cause to think about humanity in detail were suddenly thinking about it in a great deal of detail. Intelligence divisions were pulling files, diplomatic archives were being searched, and the trading posts near the edges of human space, maintained by species who had always had cordial enough commercial relations with humans, were being asked for everything they knew, every conversation they had ever had, every observation that had seemed too small to report. What emerged from all of this was a picture that was both larger and more complicated than what is their fleet strength. Because their fleet strength was, it turned out, only the most visible part. It was the part they let you count. The other parts were the things Thessalvane had tried to put into a report that no one had fully read. The 4,000 years of internal war, the doctrine that was not fixed but adaptive, the psychological relationship with being backed into corners, which the specific cultural understanding of what a warning meant and what a cross line meant and what the appropriate response to each was. And below all of that, deeper and quieter and more important than any tactical consideration, the thing that Thessalvane had tried to describe with words like restraint and proportionality and discipline and had never quite gotten right. The fact that they stopped, not because they were exhausted, not because they had reached the limit of their capability or their will. The engagement was over, the Second Fleet was gone, human space was secured, and the humans had looked at the consortium border and decided that what they had done was sufficient, and that was the end. No advance into consortium space, no demand for territory or reparations or tribute, no new warning, longer or louder than the old one. And no press conference, no declaration, no demonstration of capability designed to intimidate the remaining galactic community. They repaired the beacons. They went home. The compact chamber was very quiet when Thessalvane explained this. A representative from the Veth hegemony said, "They chose not to press the advantage." Thessalvane said, "No. They chose that the advantage was sufficient. They didn't consider the border the beginning. They considered it the end." The representative blinked, which was the Veth equivalent of a confused silence. "But they could have—" "Yes," Thessalvane said. "That's the point." He had been explaining this for 4 months, to the Directorate, to the Compact, to the various intelligence divisions and diplomatic corps and nervous military advisors who had begun requesting his time. Or he had been explaining it in the simple, direct language he had decided on during the long journey home, the language of his testimony, stripped of everything that wasn't the truth. They mean the sign. The sign is the end of their interest in you. Cross the line, they end the threat. The threat ends, they stop. Not because of mercy, not because of weakness, because they decided what the line was for, and they are absolutely clear on where it ends. Every time he said it, the room went quiet. Every time the room went quiet, he recognized the same thing in it. The particular silence of people who had been trying to understand an enemy and have just discovered that the word enemy doesn't quite fit, and the word that does fit is one they don't have yet. 2 years after the second engagement, Thessalvane was asked to deliver the Compact's first official communication to the human Commonwealth. The communication was not a demand. It was not an apology, which everyone had agreed was probably not the right register. It was a request, formally, carefully worded, for the establishment of a permanent diplomatic channel between the Commonwealth and the Compact, to be staffed at a senior level on both sides, with the goal of ensuring that no future misunderstanding of the kind the consortium had generated would be allowed to escalate to the point of engagement. Thessalvane wrote the communication himself. He delivered it through the established channels, the relay network, all the encryption keys that human communications had provided in the aftermath of the second engagement, along with the manifest of pod survivors, and a single line noting that the diplomatic observer's record had been received and filed. He waited. The response came in 11 days. It was short. It contained specific names for the proposed diplomatic channel on the human side. It contained a date for the first meeting. It contained no flourish, no rhetorical warmth, no expression of relief that communication was being established. It contained at the very end a single additional line that had not been requested and was not strictly necessary. The line said, "We noted the arbiter's 11-year dissent. That kind of honesty under institutional pressure is the beginning of trust." Thessalvane read that line 4 times. Then he read it a 5th time, slowly, with the careful attention of someone trying to understand not just what words said, but what choosing those particular words, in that order, in that position in a document, meant about the person who had chosen them. He thought about Voss, about the channel she had opened to him after the battle, about your dissent vote is logged, about a species that kept records, not because records were bureaucratically required, but because records were the material form of the belief that what you did mattered, that choices had weight, that the person who voted the wrong way in a room full of people voting the wrong way had done something real, and it was worth noting. He thought about the word trust. Not offered, not promised, not extended as a gesture of goodwill, described as a thing that began. Precise word. Beginning. Not present yet, in progress, conditional on further evidence. He thought about a species that did not perform trust. That described it accurately at the start of what might eventually become it, with no guarantee and no decoration. He wrote back, I understand. He sent it. 3 years after the second engagement, Thessa Van was the most important diplomat in the quadrant. He had not sought this. He had spent his career trying to be right and being ignored, and the transformation from ignored expert to essential expert was less satisfying than he had imagined it would be during the years of being ignored, because the circumstances that had made him essential were the very circumstances he had spent 11 years trying to prevent. But he was there, and he was needed, and he did the work. 12 species requested consultations in the first year alone. Small civilizations, large ones, old empires and young democracies and everything in between. They came to him with the same question in different forms. What should we do about them? He gave them the same answer each time. He said, think about the sign, not the fleet, not the capability, the sign. They would ask, what about it? He would say, it doesn't list consequences. Do you know why? They would offer answers, because they were confident, because they wanted to seem mysterious, because they assumed the consequences were obvious. He would shake his head. He would say, because a species that has been doing terrible things to itself for 4,000 years and has survived all of them does not need to describe what it can do. The history is the description. More, the sign is the last thing they have to say on the subject. Everything after the sign is just the history continuing. Then he would say, they are not aggressive. They have no interest in your space. They have no interest in your resources, your territory, your political structure, your religion, or your history. They will trade with you. They will negotiate with you. They will talk with you. They will build things with you. He would pause. They will not take from you, and they will not allow themselves to be taken from. Then he would say, mean the line back. The smaller species understood this immediately, the ones with their own memories of being invaded, their own histories of crossed lines and ignored warnings. And they nodded with the recognition of people who had always known this truth, but had never heard it said aloud by someone whose words carried institutional weight. The larger, older empires took longer. They were the ones who kept trying to find the strategic angle, the leverage point, the diplomatic maneuver that would give them an advantage in a relationship with humanity. The ones who read Thessavane's simple answer as a surface covering something more complex. He would tell them, there is no other layer. That is the whole answer. Some of them believed him. Some of them did not. The ones who did not, he kept files on. He was an arbiter. He witnessed. He recorded. He noted the dissent votes. The young diplomat's name was Kalith, and she was from a species that had achieved stable interstellar travel 14 months ago. She was, at least by galactic standards, brand new. Her civilization was brand new. Their ships were new and slightly unsteady, and crewed by people who were still getting accustomed to the fact that space was larger than it looked from the ground. They had applied for compact membership. They had sent their first diplomatic missions out to their nearest neighbors. They had been greeted mostly with the careful patience reserved for brand new civilizations. A mixture of genuine welcome and the assessing quality of older species, deciding whether this new arrival would be a problem or a benefit. Kalith had been assigned to the border survey mission. It was a junior posting, exactly the kind of posting given to junior diplomats to give them experience in the field without trusting them with anything that mattered yet. They were to map their neighboring space, log contacts, compile a basic diplomatic atlas. Standard work, useful work, quiet work. The route took them toward the edge of a region their navigational charts marked as human sovereign space. Kalith had read the briefing notes. She had read the Compact's guidance on approaching human space. She had read Thessavane's report because it was now required reading for every new diplomatic mission entering the quadrant. She had read the incident records of the consortium engagements, the casualty figures, the tactical summaries, the diplomatic aftermath. She had read all of it. She still wanted to see the sign. It was the sign she kept returning to, in all her reading. The description of it, the dark metal, the 47 languages, the two sentences. The 12 dead civilizations words still legible after more than a century. She had looked at the translated image in the compact archives and felt something that her briefing notes and her training and her 2 years of diplomatic education had not prepared her for. She felt recognized, not by the sign itself, by the fact that it existed, by the fact that a species had thought carefully enough about the whole sweep of history, not just their own history, but the history of every civilization that had ever existed near them, to write a warning in the languages of the dead, to think, someone will stand here one day after we are gone, and they should be able to read this, to care about that future someone enough to account for them. That was a kind of thinking she had not expected to find in a military warning. She brought the survey ship to the edge of the marked boundary and stopped. The beacon was ahead, amber steady, burning with the patient certainty of something that had been waiting a long time and expected to wait longer. She looked at it. She read the sign, all 47 languages. Some she could read directly. Her species translation AI handled the major galactic languages. Some she could read through intermediary translations. Some she could only read as a linguistic AI reconstruction, approximate. The dead languages of civilizations she had studied in xenohistory as cautionary examples of how quickly even a spacefaring civilization could disappear. All of them said the same thing. You are entering human space. You are not invited. Turn around. She sat at the viewport for a long time. She thought about the consortium. About 400 ships that had crossed this line, believing that 400 was a number that made lines negotiable. She thought about what they had found on the other side. She thought about Thesavane's report, about the simple words he had chosen, about the lines she had read 4 times because it felt true in a way that was uncomfortable. They are not aggressive. They have no interest in your space. She thought about the 12 dead civilizations, their words on this sign. She thought about what it meant to write a warning in the language of people who no longer existed. It meant, we have been here long enough to see civilizations end. We have been here long enough to know that the warning outlasts the people who need it. We are writing it for everyone because everyone will eventually stand here. She thought about standing here. She thought about being perhaps exactly the kind of person the sign had been written for. New, young, not yet certain, not yet shaped by the particular institutional confidence that had killed 640 ships. She thought about being the person the sign trusted to read it and understand. She put her hand on the navigation console. She logged a course correction. She turned the ship around. The beacon's light caught the hull as she went. Amber, warm, the slow, steady pulse of something that had been waiting for exactly this and found it satisfactory. She opened a channel to the compact relay network. She said, survey vessel reporting from the human space boundary. No contact, no incident. Returning on scheduled route. She paused. The sign is in good condition. In all 47 languages are legible. She closed the channel. She looked at the stars ahead, the ones she was moving toward now, the ones that were hers and her civilizations, and unambiguously safe. She thought about writing a report, about the sign, about what it meant, about the things she had felt looking at it that none of her briefing notes had named. She thought about what word to use for it. She found it after a while. The word was respect, not fear, not compliance, not the calculus of a civilization weighing costs and deciding the costs were too high. Something simpler and older than all of that. She had stood at the edge of something real and had recognized it for what it was, and had turned around because the turning around was the correct and honest thing to do. That was all. That was the whole of it. The stars moved past the viewport, steady and cold and full of the ordinary silence of space between one place and another. The beacon fell behind her. The amber light traveled out in every direction, toward every ship and every species and every new civilization that would eventually find its way here. Patient, permanent, written in 47 languages, including the ones that no longer had living speakers, waiting for the ones that would come after. The beacons had never needed to list consequences. The consequences were always the point.